It started on a quiet evening, the kind of evening most of us take for granted. A man, respected, accomplished, and at the height of his career, was returning to the one place where he should feel safest, his own home. But before his key could even turn in the door, flashing lights cut across the driveway. Sirens. Voices. Commands. And suddenly, he wasn't seen as a homeowner. He wasn't seen as a leader. He wasn't seen as a man who had worked his entire life to reach success. He was seen as something else entirely, a suspect. Imagine walking up to your own front door, only to be told you don't belong there. Imagine neighbors peeking out of windows, watching the scene unfold, their whispers louder than the pounding of your own heart. In a matter of seconds, everything he had built, his reputation, his dignity, his humanity, was stripped away by a single accusation: trespassing. At his own home. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a moment that exposed something deeper, an invisible weight that millions carry every single day. A reminder that no matter how high you climb, no matter what title sits in front of your name, the color of your skin can still turn you into a target. He could feel the fear rising, but also the disbelief. Was this really happening? A CEO. An educated man. A man whose face had been on business magazines, whose words had been quoted in boardrooms across America, reduced, in an instant, to nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of those who chose not to see his humanity. And yet, what happened next was something no one, neither the officers, nor the neighbors watching, nor the victim himself, could have predicted. Because this man was not only a CEO. He was not only a homeowner. He carried with him a truth, a secret, and a badge that would change everything. But before that moment came, before the reveal that would silence the air and flip the power dynamic on its head, there was the fear. The humiliation. The raw reality of standing on your own property and being told you don't belong. That is the weight of racism. That is the injustice too many live with daily. So the question becomes, how does a man who has spent his life proving himself to the world handle being reduced to a stereotype in front of his own house? What happens when the truth finally comes out, and the ones who pointed the finger are forced to confront what they've done? This is not just a story about one man. This is a story about a system, a society, and a wound that refuses to heal. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next few minutes will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and prejudice. By all accounts, Marcus Ellison had achieved what many could only dream of. Born to a working-class family in the heart of Atlanta, he had climbed the ladder one rung at a time, never forgetting the lessons his parents instilled in him: discipline, education, and integrity. From scholarships to Ivy League halls, from late nights at law libraries to boardroom victories, Marcus's life was a testament to perseverance. On paper, he was the embodiment of success. The CEO of a thriving technology company, celebrated for both his leadership and his philanthropy. His face had graced magazine covers, his interviews quoted in financial circles. He was the kind of man whose calendar was filled with back-to-back meetings, keynote speeches, and private dinners with industry giants. Yet, beneath all of the accolades, Marcus carried himself with the humility of a man who had never forgotten where he came from. At home, Marcus was not the sharp-suited executive making million-dollar decisions. He was a husband, a father, a neighbor. He loved Saturday mornings spent making pancakes with his daughter, evenings where he would sit on the back porch with his wife, and late-night phone calls to his mother, who still reminded him to stay humble, baby. His life, from the outside looking in, seemed steady. Secure. The picture of the American dream realized. His house, a modern brick estate with wide windows and a manicured lawn, stood as a quiet symbol of his journey. Each corner of it held a story: the home office where he had built his company from scratch, the living room where he and his daughter danced to old records, the kitchen table where his family bowed their heads before every meal. For Marcus, this was more than just a house. It was proof. Proof that the sacrifices, the long nights, the endless self-discipline, had not been in vain. But here's the thing about the world Marcus lived in. No amount of success, no degree, no title, could erase the deeper truth that lurked beneath. He knew it. He had felt it in glances that lingered too long, in the tightness of conversations when he walked into certain rooms. He had noticed it in security guards shadowing him at high-end stores, in the neighbors who locked their car doors just as he walked by on evening jogs. It was always there, a reminder that, for some, his achievements could never outweigh the color of his skin. Marcus learned long ago to brush it off. To stay composed, to carry himself with a calm confidence. He had no time to dwell on ignorance when he had goals to chase, a family to care for, a legacy to build. But the truth is, Racism doesn't need your permission to interrupt your life. It waits for the moment when you least expect it. It creeps into the ordinary and turns it into something unrecognizable. That evening was supposed to be ordinary. Marcus had just returned from a week of back-to-back meetings in New York. The flight home was late, and he was tired, craving nothing more than the comfort of his own bed and the quiet of his own space. As his car rolled into the driveway, the automatic lights clicked on, illuminating the familiar path up to his front door. His briefcase sat on the passenger seat, stuffed with contracts and reports he planned to review later. He exhaled, relieved to finally be home. But what Marcus didn't know was that, just beyond those automatic lights, something waited. A tension he couldn't yet see. A challenge that would unravel the very fabric of his peace. Because in a world that often measures worth by skin color rather than character, the walls of your own home can feel like the last refuge. And even there, sometimes especially there, that refuge can be shattered. The neighborhood he lived in was one of those pristine, tree-lined communities where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, the driveways lined with expensive cars, the kind of place where people prided themselves on safety and order. But safety, for Marcus, was never guaranteed. And order? Order was too often defined by someone else's perception of who belonged, and who didn't. As he stepped out of his car, Marcus felt the familiar crunch of gravel under his shoes. He glanced up at the soft glow of lights in his daughter's bedroom window. That's where his heart was, every time he pulled into this driveway. Home was where he shed the armor of the outside world and allowed himself to simply be. But that night, before his key could slide into the lock, everything shifted. A voice. A command. Flashing lights piercing the quiet street. It was happening fast, too fast, before he could even process why. Neighbors began to stir, blinds cracked open, silhouettes forming in windows. And in the pit of his stomach, Marcus felt a truth he had hoped, prayed, he would never have to face here, in this house, in this so-called safe neighborhood. Because success does not make you immune. A title does not shield you. A mansion does not protect you. Racism has a way of finding you, no matter how far you've climbed. And for Marcus Ellison, the man who had built an empire, who had provided his family with everything he never had growing up, the question now wasn't about profits or boardrooms. It was about survival. The blue and red lights washed across Marcus's driveway, painting the brick walls of his home in an eerie glow. His briefcase slipped slightly in his grip as he turned toward the noise. 2 police cruisers had pulled up, tires grinding against the curb. Doors flung open. Shadows moved fast. "Sir, step away from the property." The command hit him like a blow. Property? His property? Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice caught in his throat. He barely had time to process before another order came, sharper, louder. "Hands where we can see them. Now." For a moment, Marcus stood frozen. Every instinct told him to explain, to speak, to remind them that this was his home. But another instinct, older, heavier, warned him, one wrong move, one wrong word, could be the end of him. Neighbors' blinds were open wider now. Some stepped onto porches, phones in hand, already recording. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he knew how quickly recordings could become headlines, and how headlines could turn lives upside down. He raised his hands slowly, briefcase dangling awkwardly from one arm. The voices kept coming, overlapping. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? Keep your hands up, don't move." Marcus tried to answer, but his words were drowned out by the sharp beam of a flashlight hitting his face. His own driveway now felt like a stage, and he was the unwilling actor under a spotlight of suspicion. He thought of his daughter upstairs, maybe peeking through her curtains, her wide eyes catching the lights, her ears catching the shouts. What would she think, seeing her father treated like this? "Officer, please," Marcus finally managed, his voice calm but trembling with controlled anger. "This is my home." But the words didn't land. Instead, one officer stepped closer, hand hovering near his holster. "We got a call about a trespasser. You matched the description. So unless you want things to get worse, you need to cooperate." A trespasser. At his own home. The irony burned through him, but Marcus knew better than to let it spill into rage. His entire life, he had been trained to keep composure. To speak carefully. To never let anger become the thing that defined him. He lowered his briefcase slowly, explaining again, "I live here. My name is Marcus Ellison. This is my house." The officer scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "If that's true, you won't mind proving it." "Prove it." The words rattled in Marcus's ears. Prove that he belonged in his own space. Prove what he had already earned. Prove his humanity. His chest tightened as he pictured the documents inside, the mortgage papers in the home office, the framed family photos on the walls, the awards in his study. Evidence of a life that shouldn't need proving. And yet, in this moment, all of it meant nothing. The second officer edged closer, muttering into his radio. Marcus couldn't make out the words, but he knew what was being said: suspect detained, requesting backup. Backup. For him. He felt the shift. He wasn't Marcus Ellison, CEO, father, husband. He was now a suspect in the system's eyes. The tension in the air grew heavy, suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each second stretching longer. Every movement mattered. Every breath was calculated. Neighbors were recording, yes, but would those cameras protect him? Or would they capture the worst night of his life, reduced to a viral clip? The first officer barked again, ID. Now. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, careful, deliberate. But even then, the officer's hand tightened around his holster, ready to draw at the slightest misstep. That was the danger. No matter how cautious Marcus was, he was always one movement away from disaster. He pulled out his ID and held it up, but the flashlight flicked across it dismissively. This doesn't prove you live here. Could have been stolen. Anger surged in Marcus's chest, but he bit it down. My key. My name is on the deed. My family is inside this house right now. But before he could say more, another cruiser pulled up. More officers. More lights. The street was alive now, buzzing with suspicion and authority. His quiet evening had transformed into a scene of chaos. One officer muttered, "Let's cuff him until we sort this out." Marcus's breath caught. Cuffs. In front of his house. In front of his daughter. In front of the neighbors. The humiliation clawed at him. But deeper than humiliation was fear. He knew too many stories of men like him who didn't make it past sorting it out. His mind raced. Should he resist? No. Should he argue? Dangerous. Should he comply? Safer, but not safe. Nothing was safe. The officer reached for the cuffs, and in that split second, Marcus's entire life seemed to flash in fragments. The face of his daughter at the breakfast table, the smile of his wife on their wedding day, his mother's voice telling him to stay humble. And then, silence. Marcus didn't move. He didn't breathe. He only stared into the eyes of the man about to chain him on the very steps of the house he had built with his own hands. But there was something they didn't know. Something that could turn this entire night upside down. Because Marcus Ellison wasn't just any man standing accused of trespassing. He carried a truth in his pocket that would silence the street, wipe the smugness from their faces, and leave the officers staring in disbelief. He wasn't just a CEO. He wasn't just a homeowner. He was more than what they saw. And in the next moment, when he revealed it, everything would change. The officer's hand hovered inches from Marcus's wrist, steel cuffs glinting under the flood of red and blue. The world seemed to shrink in that instant, every sound muffled, every detail sharpened. He could smell the faint tang of oil from the squad car's engine, hear the clicking of a neighbor's phone camera capturing the scene, feel the gravel biting into the soles of his shoes. This was it. A single movement, a single misunderstanding, and his story could end here, not as a CEO, not as a father, but as another headline. Black man arrested outside his home. Marcus forced himself to breathe. Slowly. Evenly. His eyes locked onto the cuffs, then to the officer's face, cold and unyielding. He could see no curiosity there, no doubt, no willingness to listen, only the certainty that Marcus was guilty of something. Anything. And that was the breaking point. 4 years, Marcus had carried himself with patience. He had swallowed indignities, brushed off assumptions, endured the subtle and not so subtle reminders that he would always be judged first by his skin. He had told himself that success was the answer, that if he climbed high enough, worked hard enough, achieved enough, he could rise above it. But standing here, hands raised in front of his own house, with cuffs inches away, Marcus realized the truth: nothing he had done was ever enough. His voice, when it came, was steady but sharp, cutting through the tense night air. "You want proof," he said, his eyes never leaving the officers. "You want to know if I belong here?" The officers stiffened. Neighbors leaned closer. The tension deepened. Marcus lowered one hand, moving deliberately, every gesture exaggerated to avoid misinterpretation. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements so controlled it felt like time itself was holding its breath. The officer's hand twitched toward his gun, but Marcus continued, calm, precise. And then, from the fabric of his jacket, he pulled out a small leather case. He flipped it open with a practiced motion. The badge gleamed under the flashing lights. Gold. Official. Unmistakable. The FBI. For a moment, silence swallowed the street. The officer who had been seconds away from cuffing him froze mid-motion. The others exchanged looks, their faces draining of certainty. The neighbors, phone still recording, gasped audibly. Marcus's voice was low, controlled, but laced with fury that had been building for a lifetime. My name is Marcus Ellison. Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is my home. And you just profiled me on my own doorstep. The words hung heavy in the air, undeniable. One of the younger officers blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to speak but couldn't. Another shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath, as if trying to justify what had just happened. But there was no justification. Not here. Not now. Not with the truth glinting in gold in Marcus's hand. The lead officer, the one still clutching the cuffs, looked like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. His voice, when it finally came, was brittle. We had a call. A report. We were just doing our job. Marcus's eyes burned. Your job? Your job is to protect. To investigate. To serve the truth. Not to humiliate innocent people because of the color of their skin. He stepped forward, closing the gap, his badge held firmly at chest level. You looked at me and saw a trespasser. A criminal. Not a father coming home. Not a man with a career, a life, a family. You didn't see me at all. And that is the problem. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crickets seemed to hold back their song. The neighbors kept recording, the lenses of their phones capturing every word, every flicker of expression on the officers' faces. Marcus could feel his pulse racing, but for the first time tonight, it wasn't from fear. It was from anger, righteous, unshakable anger. He had spent his life proving himself, and here he was forced to prove it again, in the most humiliating way possible. One officer shifted awkwardly. We didn't know. Marcus's jaw clenched. That's exactly it. You never know. You never ask. You assume. And those assumptions kill people like me every single day. The weight of his words settled heavily on the scene. Some of the officers lowered their eyes, others stared blankly, but none dared to speak. Behind him, Marcus thought of his daughter still at the window. What had she seen? Her father nearly cuffed outside his own house, lights flashing, voices shouting. What lesson would she carry from this? That no matter how hard you work, you'll never be safe? Or that sometimes, you have to stand your ground and force the world to see you? His hand tightened around the badge. This moment would not define him as a victim. It would define him as a man who refused to be erased. Marcus took one last look at the officers, their faces now pale, their confidence stripped away. Do your job better, he said, his voice quiet but laced with finality. And with that, he turned back toward his door. His key slid into the lock, his body tense with fury and exhaustion. He didn't wait for their apologies. He didn't need their excuses. The truth was already recorded by every neighbor's camera, already burned into the memory of everyone watching. As the door opened and Marcus stepped inside, the air behind him buzzed with whispers, murmurs, and the uneasy silence of men who had been caught in the act. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't just about one night, one house, one man. It was about something far larger. Something that would ripple beyond his driveway, beyond his neighborhood, beyond this single humiliating encounter. And as the door closed behind him, shutting out the flashing lights, Marcus whispered to himself a single thought that burned like fire in his chest. This isn't over. When the door closed behind Marcus that night, the flashing lights still flickered through the curtains. The hum of radios, the muffled voices of officers, the whispers of neighbors, they all lingered outside. But inside his home, the silence was deafening. He leaned against the door for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, the badge still clenched tightly in his hand. Upstairs, his daughter's voice broke the silence. Daddy? It was soft, uncertain, carrying the tremor of what she had just witnessed. Marcus swallowed hard and forced his voice steady. It's okay, baby. Daddy's home. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't okay. Not for her. Not for him. Not for anyone who carried the same burden every time they stepped outside. That night, Marcus tucked his daughter into bed, brushed back her curls, and whispered promises that the world would one day be different. Yet in his own heart, he wondered, would it? The next morning, the incident was no longer confined to one driveway. The neighbors' recordings, uploaded within hours, had spread like wildfire. Social media carried the images of a black man in a tailored suit, hands raised in his own yard, surrounded by police officers. They carried the sound of his steady, defiant voice as he revealed his FBI badge. They carried the silence of officers caught in their own bias. News outlets picked it up. Headlines clashed. Some framed him as a hero who stood his ground. Others spun the story into questions about miscommunication or procedures. But the truth was undeniable. Here was a man who had done everything society told him to do: work hard, succeed, contribute, and still, he was treated as if he didn't belong. For Marcus, the hardest part wasn't the public reaction. It was the private one. His daughter's questions. His wife's worried glances. The knowledge that this wouldn't be the last time. That his badge, his title, his success, none of it could shield him from being seen as a threat first and a man second. And that was the deeper wound. Because Marcus knew his story had ended differently than it could have. He had the badge. He had the power to flip the narrative in an instant. But what about the countless others who didn't? What about the men and women pulled over, questioned, cuffed, humiliated, or worse, with no badge, no recording, no neighbors watching? Their stories didn't always make headlines. Sometimes, they didn't make it home at all. That realization cut deeper than any humiliation. Marcus wasn't just thinking of himself anymore. He was thinking of every name he had seen scrolling across news tickers, every face held up at rallies, every family mourning the weight of injustice. He was thinking of the systems that allowed suspicion to outweigh humanity, over and over again. In the days that followed, Marcus was invited to speak on talk shows, to give interviews, to lend his story as an example of bias in action. But every time he stepped onto a stage, every time a microphone was pressed to his lips, he remembered that night. The cuffs glinting. The officer's cold eyes. His daughter's whisper at the window. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted change. So he spoke not for himself, but for the countless others whose stories ended in silence. He spoke of reform, of accountability, of the need to strip away the blinders that allowed officers to see threat where there was none. He spoke not with anger alone, but with urgency, the urgency of a father who wanted his daughter to inherit a safer world. And people listened. Some in agreement, some in denial. Some cheered his courage, others dismissed his experience. But the conversation sparked, and conversations, Marcus knew, could grow into movements. Because this was never just about one man in one driveway. It was about the invisible lines that divide us. It was about the assumptions that kill. It was about a truth too many know too well: you can have the title, the house, the badge, and still be seen as less. As Marcus walked through his neighborhood in the weeks that followed, things felt different. Some neighbors avoided his gaze. Others offered awkward apologies. A few offered genuine support. But Marcus carried himself the same way he always had, with quiet dignity, with unshaken pride. Because if his story could open even one pair of eyes, could shatter even one assumption, then the humiliation of that night would not be wasted. Yet the question still haunted him in the quiet hours: how many more lives would be tested like his before change came? How many more front porches, driveways, and sidewalks would turn into stages of suspicion? And now that question passes to you, the listener. Because this isn't just Marcus's story. This is a mirror. A mirror held up to society, to neighbors, to police, to each of us. It asks, when you see a black man in a suit, a hoodie, or anything in between, what do you see first? A threat? Or a human being? That night, Marcus survived the injustice because he carried a badge. But justice cannot depend on badges. It cannot depend on titles. It must depend on truth, on fairness, on recognizing each other's humanity. Until then, no success, no wealth, no achievement will ever be enough to guarantee safety. So the challenge is this: will we continue to look away, to dismiss, to excuse? Or will we finally face the reality that racism is not a glitch in the system, it is the system? The lights may have faded from Marcus's driveway, but the echo of that night remains. And it forces us to ask, how many more will it take before we change? Because the next Marcus might not carry a badge. The next Marcus might not make it home. And that truth should haunt us all.